Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to class. Today we have come to the conclusion of the course and we will take a very quick review of what we did in the course out of these 12 modules, what we did in the course, and the themes and ideas, concepts covered in the course. What was the mandate of the course? Why did we design this course, and what is expected out of you out of this course after successfully completing this course. So we'll review and have some concluding remarks about the course in fundamental concepts of social linguistics. As you recall, in our introduction video also we talked about a broad mandate of the course. The course says fundamental concepts in social linguistics. So during this journey of 12 weeks and 12 modules, you might have noticed that we tried to touch upon all important significant concepts which as a sociolinguist or as a learner in social linguistics, as a student of social linguistics, we should know. The mandate of the course was to make you familiar with pertaining important significant themes in social linguistics. Language is a beautiful phenomenon, a social phenomenon. We talked about language as a phenomenon, properties of phenomenon. We talked about the acquisition process, how language comes to us. We also, in various discussions, we talked about language in use, in action. We had various socio-cultural contours and the indexes. We talked about how language interacts with other social indexes, like how language interacts with other social index, like gender, like class, like reason, like age. We talked about varieties of language in terms of language, dialect, register, style, lingua franca, pidgin, creole. We talked about language contact. So this course outlined all major themes and topics relevant in social linguistics. However, it does not claim that we have covered entire range of social linguistics. We try to focus on some aspects of it, some themes of it, and also try to survey the emergence and development of the field. So we try to locate language in a socio-cultural space, language as a phenomenon, and language in action. Very quickly we will see how did we go about it. So in week 1, module 1, we talked about the idea called social linguistics, the subdiscipline of linguistics, how social linguistics is an interface of language and society. We talked about language as a system, a complete system, a complex system, a beautiful underlying system, and it has multiple subsystems within it. So systems like phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. These all systems which are in perfect balance, and these all systems together constitute language as a complex system. These systems in their own right are a complete system. So we talked about phonology, which talks about structure of sound and sound patterns of a language, morphology, combination of sounds, a meaningful combination of sounds. Then we talked about combination of meaningful combination of these words into long strings of sentences, and then how meaning is derived out of the structure, and how we understand. In semantics we learnt about meaning, derivation of meaning, how it is derived, interpreted, and at the level of pragmatics we learnt how utterances, sentences, expressions are interpreted in real world situation. So, these 5 levels we talked about, 5 levels of representation we talked about. Then we talked about design features of human language by Charles Hockett. 16 features we talked about, and in detail we tried to establish how human language and communication system is different, sophisticated, and so significant compared to other communication systems in the entire animal kingdom. Then we talked about language and culture, language and gender, and we also tried to understand the linguistic relativity, how language influences our thought, our cognition process. We talked about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, critically examined Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. We talked about relationship between language and culture, how language encodes the culture, our shared memories, our shared history, our shared collective social history. So, language becomes instrumental in asserting our identity, how we form and construct identity. And we talked about language and gender, how language encodes gender, how language is represented in gender, sexism and language. So, this was the overall fundamental preliminary understanding of language as a phenomenon, characteristics of language, language and culture, society and gender. This was week 1, module 1, and I hope that you understand these preliminary ideas and concepts. For detailed understanding, you can again go back to module 1 and all these videos. Then we move to how language comes to us. So, in module 2, week 2, we move to how language comes to us. How do we acquire language? Human child acquires language effortlessly, without any visible effort. It becomes a child's play. But we also know that as an adult, it becomes challenging for us to acquire and learn a language, right? So, what are the explanations? What are the theoretical implications? What are the theoretical positions to understand acquisition of language? And we talked about 2 important theoretical positions in language acquisition. One was behaviorist tradition, and we knew that how behaviorist approach was presented as a conclusive presentation in the work by B.F. Skinner, published in 1957, known as verbal behavior, which relied on fundamental tenets of behaviorism. Depending on explanation is depended on the externally perceptible linguistic behavior in terms of stimulus response chain, operant conditioning, the idea of tabula rasa, that human child is born with tabula rasa, a blank slate, nothing, no preconceived notion and knowledge about the world and about the language at the time of birth, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement and habit formation. So, behaviorists looked at language as part of total human behavior, linguistic behavior part of total human behavior. We also talked about how Chomsky criticized this approach and came up with mentalism or generative paradigm. He postulates two important hypotheses: linguistic nativism and innateness hypothesis. And in order to support his innateness hypothesis, he comes up with two notions: language acquisition device (LAD) and universal grammar. So, the idea of tabula rasa is done away with in Chomsky paradigm, and what we see, a human child is born with a language acquisition device that enables the child to pick up any language, to learn any language, to acquire any language effortlessly, because the child has all underlying universal principles of language that governs human language at its disposal, and child acquires a language from the primary linguistic data that triggers this mechanism, and the child learns in terms of hypothesis testing, and it becomes easy for a child to learn so easily. And he talked about linguistic competence. So, in ideal speaker and listener situation, where the knowledge of language is not restricted by the memory loss or any other external factors, it is tacit and innate. Then we looked at key concepts in language acquisition, and all these smaller concepts like tabula rasa, operant conditioning, stimulus response chain, like reinforcement, like LAD, language acquisition device, like universal grammar, poverty of stimulus, right, and all such concepts were discussed in our lecture, key concepts in language acquisition. Then we talked about a counter argument by Dalhams, who countered the Chomsky idea of linguistic competence by saying that the language structures are learned in terms of their functions in the socio-cultural space, and he merges the two distinctions and calls it communicative competence. We had discussion in detail in communicative competence class. Then we talked about critical period hypothesis, the idea that why an adult finds it so difficult to learn a language at grown up age, and why acquisition of language becomes a child's play and so easy for a child, is discussed in critical period hypothesis, that refers to a biological window period and a threshold before which all these underlying tacit principles are available to the child to set the parameters, and once the parameters are set, the rules cease to be, and that threshold is puberty, age of puberty. By the time we reach the age of puberty, these rules cease to be, and we construct and create our own grammar in that particular target language. So, critical period hypothesis refers to that biological period, that biological window, and for details you can watch this video. Moving on, after that we came in the third module, in third week, we talked about language in society. We talked about speech community. We talked about a typical sociolinguistic situation where two languages exist together, and the speech community stratifies one language over the other in terms of functions and use. Ferguson calls it diglossia, where two languages, dimensions too, so where two languages are functional for different social functions. One language is chosen over the other for different functions in the society, and the society is bilingual society. Then we talked about systemic functions of language by M.K. Halliday as a counter narrative to, as a counter theory to Chomsky tradition. Then we talked about ethnography of communication and the speaking model, SPEAKING, all these letters in the word is speaking. This is an acronym, all stand for different context and elements of communication. This was proposed by Dalhams in ethnography of communication. Then we talked about other variety like register and style of language, right, where register is domain specific, purpose specific, and the style is level of formality that we assign: casual, non-casual, formal, highly formal, not formal. So, this variety we talked about in module 3. For more understanding and details and reinforcement, you can go back and watch these videos again. Moving on to the 4th module and 4th week, we talked about manifestations. So, bilingualism and idea of bilingual mind, language in use, how a single user, individual user uses two or more varieties of language or languages with equal ease, and how this enables the person to draw from rich linguistic repertoire and resources available. So, bilingualism we saw, multilingualism we saw as a resource available to, varied resource available to the users. And as a consequence of bilingualism, we saw the tendency of code mixing and code switching, where the individual user uses two different codes and two different languages to achieve maximum communicability. We looked at the patterns of mixing and we looked at the motivations of mixing. We talked about language hybridity, and I gave an example of Hindi English mixing, but it happens with all languages like Punjabi English mixing, Tamil English mixing, or you can have any two languages which are in contact for a longer time, sustained contact. They are hybrid, they become hybrid because the borrowing, mixing goes in both the directions. It is a bidirectional process. Then we talked about cause and effect of long contact, Pidgin and Creole, right? Creolization as a birth of new language. So, we learned that when two communities come in contact because of trade relations, because of colonial history, because of some war and migration, it happens that two communities come together where no language is common and they require to fulfill their communication needs, and for that a new rudimentary code is developed where the vocabulary and words are drawn from one variety and structures are drawn from the other variety, other language, and the third language, a kind of restricted code emerges. So, a very rudimentary restricted code emerges which fulfills a very limited communication needs of that community. But over a period of time the functions are extended and these pidgins are extended, they become extended pidgin with enriched vocabulary and complex syntactic structures, and a pattern emerges out of it, and then subsequent generations start acquiring this extended pidgin as mother tongue, and the moment this extended mother tongue extended pidgin becomes mother tongue of any subsequent generation, it is called Creole. And then later on we have the process of standardization and the process of decreolization, and this is how a new language is born. And if you look at the colonial history of the world, you might find a lot of European languages based creoles, like in English based creoles, French based creoles. So, there are examples and they are all around the world. In India also you have Assamese based Creole like Assamese and Naga called Nagamese, right. Then we move to mixing and switching, which is a creative outcome of a bilingual multilingual mind, which is not seen as a deficit hypothesis, which is not seen as a deficit of linguistic resource, but it should be seen as an augmentation of two resources or multiple resources the user may have at his or her disposal to use. So, this is what we learnt in week 4 module 4, and for details you can go back and watch these videos again. Then in module 5 week 5 we talked about language planning, language policy, and the planning and policy was very important in the post-colonial world in the second half of the 20th century. We see the post-colonial world with multiple nations and countries getting freedom from colonial forces and a linguistic situation chaotic, and they are struggling to straighten out their linguistic policies, language policies and planning. We learned language planning as a concept, we learned types of language planning, we learned process of language planning, we learned about official language, we learned about Indian context and Indian situation where we have 3 language formula, and we also learnt about a constitutional provision that promotes multilingual fabric of the country known as the 8th schedule, which lists a number of languages as official languages. Moving on, in module 6 we talked about mother tongue, native language, mother tongue, first language, so many nomenclature available. So, what is mother tongue and claimed mother tongues in Indian context, Indian society, and we refer to census data 2011. We learnt about linguistic diversity of India. India is such a diverse country with multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilingual practices, and multiple families like Indo-Aryan family, Dravidian family, Austro-Asiatic family, Sino-Tibetan or Tibeto-Burman family, So, all these families we studied. We also studied scheduled and non-scheduled languages of India, where the scheduled languages are those languages listed in the Constitution of India in its 8th schedule as official languages, and other which are fighting and demanding their inclusion. We also learnt the phenomenon of multilingualism in India and its reflection in Indian education system. So, we talked about language and education policy with reference to official languages of India, with reference to 1968 national policy on education, 1986 national policy on education, then 2020 NEP national education policy, and other subsequent developments regarding that. And finally, in this module we talked about arrival and negotiation of English in the Indian linguistic ecology, and how English arrived in India as a language of traders, settled here and became one of the most important languages of this Indian linguistic ecology. And for more details you can always watch this video, and for reinforcement you can review these videos and watch them again. In module 7 we talked about emergence of sociolinguistics, modern sociolinguistics in 1960s and the process. We talked about language and variation, and we talked about major works and founding fathers of sociolinguistics, starting with William Lebov and his very celebrated Martha Vineyard Island study. We also talked about social stratification of English in New York City, again done by William Lebov, and 2 very significant concepts that we need to understand: observer's paradox and sociolinguistic variables. Then we talked about Dalheims and his contribution in shaping this newly emerged discipline. And we talked about communicative competence, we talked about ethnography of communication, and we talked about the speaking model by Dalheims in this course. You can always go back and watch these videos again. Moving on, we continued with our survey with the founding fathers and the important pillars who gave shape to this discipline, and among them we talked about Basil Bernstein, we talked about John J. Gumper's interactional social linguistics that he talked about. We talked about Joshua Fishman, sociology of language, Uriel Vanruch for his bilingualism discussion, Suzanne Irwin Tripp and her work, Charles Ferguson and very celebrated work Diglossia in his context and his work. Our survey continued in module 9 as well, and we talked about William Wright and his work, who studied languages and culture in California and so many other Native American languages. We talked about Ellen Grimshaw, Einar Huygen, who is also credited for linguistic ecology, the term he coined and the concept he talked about, language planning and policy, Norwegian language he worked, and that gave birth to a lot of other subsequent arguments and publications and works. We talked about systemic grammar and systemic functions of language of M.A.K. Halliday and his work. We also surveyed important variation studies in week 9, starting from William Lebob's Martha Vineyard Island study, coming to linguistic certification of English in social certification of English in New York City, again done by William Leboff, then Norwich study, then Detroit study, then Belfast study, and Cardiff study by Copland. So, a survey of all the significant variation studies we have done in week 9, module 9. You can always go back and watch them again for clarity and understanding. Moving on, in module 10, we talked about Indian English. Right. So, we are not talking about English in India anymore, Indian English, because English has been, it has grown here. It arrived as a language of traders, as a foreign language, but over centuries it has settled here, negotiating with other Indian languages, and has occupied, because of our colonial history, it occupies a higher position. So, it gets supremacy over rest of the Indian languages. It becomes marker of our identity and a tool for upward social mobility, and we have discussed various issues related to it, a domain of influence, how Indian English has become a language of trade, commerce, science and technology, administration and parliamentary affairs. We talked about multilingual societies and multilingual discourses. We talked about endangered languages in India and endangered languages all over the world, the idea of endangerment of languages, how language becomes extinct. We talked about linguistic tension and linguistic movement, language movement across the world, citing various examples from Quebec, for example, to Scots, Gaelic, to case of Bangladesh, erstwhile Pakistan. And also we talked about language movements and linguistic undercurrents in Indian context. Moving on in module 11, week 11, we talked about 20th century departure from the past in linguistic studies and language sciences, where it is marked with the first quarter of the century is marked with the work and approach of Ferdinand de Saussure, who is also called father of modern linguistics and founder of a structuralist theory and paradigm. We talked about key concepts of Saussure, like sign, signifier, signified, like langue and parole, like syntagm and paradigm, like synchrony and diachrony, internal external linguistics. So many concepts, key concepts, which laid foundation for emergence of a new theoretical approach known as structuralism. And we also surveyed how structuralism was established and spread all over. We also talked about European structuralism and its major thrust. We talked about American structuralism and its fundamental characteristics, and we surveyed the theoretical developments in 20th century. So, almost 100 years of history, where we see the first half of the 20th century is dominated by structuralists and structuralism as a paradigm. Behaviorism emerges out of it, and by mid 1950s we see another paradigm coming up, generative paradigm and Chomsky paradigm, with subsequent reviews and changes in the paradigm. We talked about variety of language and tried to dispel some concepts about, let us say, language, dialect, sociolect, regional dialect, register, style, lingua franca, and so on. A very new concept emerging as a subdiscipline in sociolinguistics is linguistic landscape. We had a detailed discussion about linguistic landscape, and also how the works by Landry and Boris made a difference, and people started working on linguistic landscape in multilingual societies. Linguistic landscape refers to a location or a regional region or an area where we see language in visual terms, in terms of signages, symbols, names of the streets, buildings. So, how you find languages present in the public space, and that also talks about the multilingual character of the region, of the society, of the culture you are targeting to study in. So, we talked about linguistic landscape, a newly emerged and evolving subdiscipline within sociolinguistics. And finally, we are here today in the last week of the module, that is 12th module, last week of the module, 12th module, and there we talked about linguistic allegiance, identity and socialization in digital space. This is a very important phenomenon. It is also emerging as a subdiscipline in sociolinguistics, where we are trying to understand the language and its use in digital space. So, internet has brought a lot of changes, technological advancement and revolution, which has started as a technological revolution, has changed into a social revolution. The way we socialize, the way we interact, the way we share, the way we assert, the way we construct our identity, everything has changed, because society is under a fresh digital configuration. What Manuel Cassel calls it, a network society, right. So, we are into information age, and how language is changing in digital space. We also had a very quick look at the presence of Indian languages in the digital space, and we also established that the scope is high and the situation is not very grim as it is portrayed, because Indian languages, presence of Indian languages is growing at the rate of 18%, whereas English is growing at 3% in the Indian digital space. It may be argued that not all Indian languages are getting space on the internet and digital space, but primarily responsibility lies in with the community who is promoting and making their own language felt present in the digital space. Then finally, we recapitulated the idea of language acquisition, theories and concepts, and today we are going to conclude this course with this video. So, I firmly believe that the goal with which we started this course, the discussions that we had during the course, and the questions that you posted on the forum, and also your active participation in our live sessions must have helped you understand these fundamental concepts, and as you may please, you can take up any of these issues for your further studies, advanced studies, and you can go deeper into such issues. But one thing is for sure, that now we understand the language that we speak. It's such a beautiful phenomenon. It comes to us so naturally that we hardly realize the complexity of it. And the beauty is that we acquire it effortlessly in our childhood. And language is not simply means of communication and tool for communication, but it goes much beyond that. It transcends the limit of time and space, and it identifies and defines who we are, we as a person. It determines our identity, and it helps us organize groups and communities. It's a very powerful phenomena, and hope to connect with you very soon with some more ideas and advanced ideas somewhere else in some on some other occasion. But you have the forum and the contacts. We will stay in touch, and I would love to answer your queries and questions. So with this, we come to conclusion of this course, and I hope that this course has created much desired curiosity and interest in this field, and all of you will pursue your quest in this direction and come up with some new ideas, fresh ideas and perspectives. So with this, thank you very much for joining this course, being with me, interacting with me, and making me learn more along with your own learning. Thank you very much. God bless you.